how are you? Welcome back to my office, and thank you for commenting on the last video, some of you, on where you want to go when we finish Genesis. So if you have other thoughts about things that you'd like to study together, please feel free to let me know here as well, and I'll keep working on that, and I'll let you know in a couple of weeks what's coming up. Okay, so this is our last week with Abraham. We saw Abram and Sarai leave their home and their families and everything that they had ever known and loved, believing the promise that God would make their family a great nation, and that the life-giving divine energy that flowed out of Eden would now somehow flow through them, so that through them all the families of the earth would be blessed. And then we saw them get impatient and try to seize control of this divine plan for themselves, taking advantage of and then discarding their slave Hagar. But then finally, in chapter 21, Abraham and Sarah's son, Isaac, the child of the promise, as he's called, is born. And that's where our story picks up, chapter 22. So let's see. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you." So Abraham rose early the next morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in a distance that God had shown him. Skipping down a bit. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. Then he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. What? What the heck is he doing? He's about to kill his own son, whom he loves? And Isaac, no less, the child of the promise. Won't this also make the covenant void? You can't be a great nation without descendants. It's obviously a test, as the text itself states. After these things, God tested Abraham, which of course raises all sorts of troubling questions about the nature of this God, but we'll leave those to the side for right now. Today, I'm interested in the psychology of Abraham. Why would he obey such a heinous command? Why not just tell God no? Go screw yourself. If you're the child sacrifice demanding type, I'm not interested in your covenant anyway. Notice that when God told Abraham to sacrifice his child, Abraham didn't say, "Okay, how do you do that? Is there a liturgy for that?" No, Abraham knows exactly what's up. This is what the gods are like. They demand everything. This is the kind of crap that Abraham left behind when he set out from Ur of the Chaldeans and smashed up all of his father's idols. So why does he put up with it now? Some rabbis have wondered, what if Abraham had done just that? Maybe Abraham actually failed this test. Perhaps he was supposed to argue with God the way he just had a few chapters ago when God was threatening to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember, he said, "Are you kidding me, God? You're going to blow up the whole town and kill the righteous along with the wicked? What if there were 50 righteous people in the city, God? Would you spare it for the sake of those 50? No, Abraham has no problem with God committing murder as such. He just thinks that a more targeted strike would be more appropriate. But again, we're leaving aside for now all the troubling questions this passage raises about God, and we're focusing on the psychology of Abraham. So anyway, God says, "No, if there were 50 righteous people in Sodom, I'd forgive the entire city for the sake of those 50. So then Abraham, with some kind of classic, like, know-it-all preteen boy snark, says, "Okay, but what if there were 45? Are you telling me that you'd destroy a whole city because of the difference of 5 people?" So God says, "No, I wouldn't do it if there were 45. So Abraham goes down to 40. And you see where this is going. They actually keep going like this until they get down to 10 people, and Abraham finally lets it go. But what happened to that Abraham? He'd fight for a city, but when it comes to his own son, suddenly he's lost all his spunk? By the way, this is kind of a sidebar, but we didn't really talk about Sodom and Gomorrah at all. As you know, it's been used at certain times in Christian history as one of the premier gay-bashing passages of the Bible. But that's not at all what it's about. The story goes that angels, and that's important, angels were passing through the city of Sodom, and Abraham's nephew, Lot, took them in and gave them a meal and a place to sleep. But before they could even get into bed, all the men in the whole town start pounding on Lot's door and yelling, "Who are those guys you have staying with you?" They're actually angels, remember. "Send them outside so we can gang rape them." Well, already this is a super weird story, but I hope you can see how different moral questions might be at stake here than when we're talking about, I don't know, two married dudes having boring married sex. But that's the kind of glaring lack of nuance with which this passage often gets read. So Lot comes outside and he says, "Guys, please don't be such jerks. These men, they're angels, are guests in my house. Look, I have 2 daughters. Why don't you just gang rape them instead?" I swear to God, I'm not making this up. You can read the text. So the mom says, "You're not even from here, Lot. Don't judge us." And then they try to knock down the door, but the angels pull Lot back inside and they strike the whole mob blind with their angel magic. So then the mob can't find the door and they just go home. And then the angels get Lot and most of his family out of the city before burning it to the ground. So, of course, there are all kinds of things going on in that story. And frankly, it seems to me that homosexuality is not really the most important part of it. In fact, the prophet Ezekiel says that the sin that resulted in Sodom's destruction was inhospitality and a lack of generosity. Well, that's perhaps putting the case a bit mildly, but the point is that Ezekiel doesn't even mention the sex. The problem is treating visitors badly. In fact, the only intra-biblical interpretation of this story that says it's about the sex is the New Testament epistle of Jude. He says that they, quote, indulged in sexual immorality. The word is porneu, from which we get our word pornography. But it doesn't tell you what kind of sexual immorality we're dealing with. It's conceivable, isn't it, that the sexual immorality thing Jude is referring to is not primarily the same gender sexual attraction, but the gang rape. Actually, Jude is a little bit more specific than that, but let's circle back to him. Look at what 2 Peter has to say about this, also in the New Testament. "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned..." Now, what is he talking about? The angels sinned. This takes us back, doesn't it, to Genesis chapter 6, the Watchers and the Nephilim. Remember? Taking the daughters of human beings as their wives. "And if God did not spare the ancient world, even though he saved Noah," this is again how we know that he's talking about the Nephilim, because he goes right to Noah. "And if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction and made them an example of what is coming to the ungodly," and he goes on. But the point is that Peter, the 2 Peter, connects Sodom and Gomorrah with the sin of the Watchers and with the flood. What was that about? Remember, the problem was that the Watchers, or the sons of God, were taking the daughters of humans as their wives and trying to reunite heaven and earth by their sexual union. The problem was angel-human crossbreeding. And what happened at Sodom? Well, remember, the men of the town were trying to rape the angels staying at Lot's house. So Lot offers up his daughters instead. And as horrifying as that is, the point seems to be to turn the mob's lust away from their unnatural desire for angels to a natural desire for human beings. And that's, in fact, what Jude goes on to say. The verse that I quoted to you earlier in full says they, quote, indulged in sexual immorality, porneo, and pursued unnatural lusts, or the NIV translates that as perversion. Interestingly, the King James Version is the best here. It says that they went after, quote, strange flesh. In the Greek, it's sarkos heteros, from heteros, meaning other, as in heterosexual. The problem was not that they were pursuing flesh that was too much like theirs, as in the mob was all male and they were trying to have sex with other men. The problem was that they were pursuing flesh that was too different from theirs, too other. As in, the mob was all human and they were trying to have sex with angels. The sin of Sodom was not homosexuality. It can't have been on Jude's reading, or Ezekiel's for that matter. The sin for which God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah was the same as that for which God earlier destroyed the entire freaking world. It was an angel-human crossbreeding. That's something that God seems to be really, really opposed to. Somebody should tell the Westboro Baptist Church, right? If ever there has been a biblical thing to protest in order to avoid apocalyptic disaster, it's angel-human crossbreeding. Anyway, that's a super long footnote. Back to Abraham. Why on earth did Abraham agree to kill his own kid? The 18th century Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard reflected long and hard on this story in a book called Fear and Trembling. Kierkegaard was taken mostly by Abraham's silence in this story. Abraham has nothing to say. He can't defend himself because there's no defense for his action. By any moral metric, Abraham is a murderer. It must be the case, Kierkegaard concludes, that the relation to God, or to the absolute, as he calls it, stands somehow beyond or at least outside of the matrices of moral reasoning. There's something really compelling about Kierkegaard's claim, I think. In fact, Fear and Trembling is my favorite book. It's been a constant companion since I first read it about 15 years ago. If you're at all interested in the story of Abraham, I really recommend it. But of course, this conception can also justify all sorts of evil in the name of God. So it can also be quite dangerous. Anyway, that's something to chew on as you go about your day. So what happened with Abraham and Isaac? We didn't finish the story. Read again. When they came to the place that God had showed them, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So that's how the story ends. Isaac gets to live, though he's definitely going to sleep with one eye open from now on. Abraham proves his faith, not faith in the existence of God or even the goodness of God, but his trust that God will keep the covenant promises made way back in chapter 12. And God repudiates the sacrificial demands of the pagan gods Abraham is used to. But did you catch how all that happened? They're on a mountain. Verse 2 says so. And in the middle of that mountain is a tree or a bush from which the source of life for Isaac is provided. If you're thinking back to another tree at the center of another mountain from which life and divine energy flows out to the whole world, or even if you're thinking ahead to the New Testament, when another tree on top of another mountain becomes the source of life for the world, then you're starting to get a handle on how canonical reading of the Bible works. Okay, that's it for now. Next week, on to Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau. Be well.